Welcome back to another Coffee with Developers. I'm very happy here to be with Rob Bateman today, who's actually from the CEO of Away Studios. What does that mean? It's not a travel agency. It actually is something that I think it's very important. In the past, when I started as a web developer, we had not much in terms of multimedia, and then Flash came around, and that just broke the mold. Like there was a big fight between the web standards people and Flash people, and you were a Flash developer back then, and you also did a lot of 3D stuff in Flash. And nowadays, it seems like we have a whole period of massive creativity that kind of went away when Flash became unsupported. Is this something that you feel as well, or is this something that you see that Flash is over and we had to move to somewhere else?
Yeah, Flash has been was originally something which was for design, was created for designers to create animations, and then it kind of started to become more of a development tool. And I think because of that combination from a sort of designer route, it became a very interesting ecosystem where lots of people would experiment with new things, new ways of interaction on the web. And because it was so compatible with all browsers, it was easy to publish stuff out and have lots of people instantly see your work. So it was kind of like an early precursor to the sort of stuff that people now do on, YouTube or other sort of streaming apps. But at the time, there was just nothing there that you could, use like that. And Flash was much better to download and to interact with, and much more compatible. And yeah, it was a sort of revelation to a lot of people, I think. And our 3D stuff was very popular back in the day. We did Away 3D Engine, which was the sort of go-to 3D engine in the Flash player. Flash added like hardware acceleration towards the end of its life, so we also added that to our engine, and that was another big hit. It meant that a lot of sort of games that were previously doing very simple stuff could suddenly have hardware accelerated 3D graphics in their games, which made a big difference to, people like, even like isometric games like Farmville used graphics acceleration, and Away 3D was essentially the largest 3D engine in Flash that used the Stage 3D APIs. So it was very big for the time. And then when Flash stopped, of course, a lot of people moved on to Unity. I think it probably was the de facto place where people ended up for their skill sets and the ways of working and so on. But Unity is not really about web; it's more about apps. So the web was kind of left a little high and dry for a while.
There were two sides to a degree when I always thought about Flash. There was like the designy side of things, and that's where the timeline came in, which was very much a very cool tool for people to use, that came from video editing, that came from other streaming technology. Was, of course, the ActionScript side of it, where you could actually write Flash games in code. And the two things together were like this perfect storm of creative people jumping onto it. People, as you said, that came from games development, that came from the demo scene as well. I know a lot of those people ended up in the Flash scene because there was already a core platform that you could work with. Whereas like on the web, it's like you didn't know what the browser could do. You could not rely on things. JavaScript wasn't as rich as it was right now. We just started working with Canvas. SVG was incredibly slow. And like the VML stuff that Microsoft came out with was just unreadable. And it was just a very interesting world where the people of the web were like, this is a plugin, this is not native to the web, it's a black hole. And at the same time, a lot of creative people liked this kind of like limitation and said like, at least I can trust it, at least I can rely on it. Do you think there was a problem when Flash went through its different iterations as well, like Flash 4 to Flash 5, ActionScript 4, 5, these kind of things? Do you think that there was a drop-off at the end where it became more programmy rather than like less designy?
I think it probably shifted more towards like commercialized games and less from the experimental roots that it came from. But the weird thing was that it had a lot of stuff that came with it, a lot of features, like, for example, a lot of the camera features allowed you to do like real-time camera tracking because it would just work with the webcam stream that was available inside the browser. And like you say, a lot of these features were really not well developed in JavaScript. So it was the only option if you wanted to do online experimental stuff like that. It was a lot more stable than JavaScript as well. But of course, JavaScript gradually improved to the point where probably around sort of 2011, 2012, it passed it in terms of features and capability. But Flash still was very much the sort of tool of choice for a lot of game developers, because it was this perfectly sort of orchestrated combination of design and code. So designers loved the tool being able to like animate everything inside there in a scripted manner as well, so that you had some form of interactions built into your animation. And then developers like the AS3 language, which was the last sort of iteration of ActionScript, which had much more power available to it because it had a just-in-time compiler, and it was much more feature-rich. So it had this real good combination of power and design elements that you couldn't really get anywhere else. And in some senses, you still don't have a replacement. Certainly in the combination of the tool and the language.
Well, we still don't have alpha channel video on the web. It's basically something that
well, exactly, yeah,
really hard. And how did Silverlight came into it? Like, was it even a blip on the radar of people? Were people moving away from Flash to Silverlight, or was it too late to the game to actually bring in another plugin?
Well, yeah, I think Silverlight just came at the wrong time, and it didn't really catch the audience that it wanted. It was basically trying to be Flash, but a Microsoft flavor. And I think it really didn't offer enough to allow people, to make people want to swap over in great numbers. Flash was by far the more supported and more installed plugin. So why would you use one that was less compatible and have less users as a result? It never really, Silverlight never really got there. But I think, it was mainly because of the timing of its release.
Yeah, I remember there were others. There were like lots of plugins at the time that tried to get into that market. It didn't work out at all. I mean, what was it? Real Player had interactive features as well, and it was interesting stuff really early on, like 1998, 1999. So it really like they had things that were amazing, but everybody just used it for buffering videos and waiting for them. That was the classic thing.
Real Player was it's not something that I actually had to work with at the BBC when I worked there. It almost was a precursor. It almost predates Flash in some ways. So it's super old school.
So now your job, to a degree, as we said before, there's lots of creativity went into it. Like almost every design website that won awards back then was a Flash site. There were lots of online cartoons, online games that actually weekly by weekly ended up more than they were. I worked with beta.com a lot in England, I just did random stuff there. They were just beautiful Flash animations that ended up in Channel 4 as well, or in like Visa ads and all kind of stuff. Like that aesthetic of the like kind of janky, very, very flat things became a huge hit. And it kind of had a resurgence now when you look at like how like South Park became a big thing and never ever went into the 3D space, a lot of animation now looks super flat again as well. But there's a lot of creativity that's completely lost. So your company or your job is what you're doing right now is converting these old tools to newer technologies, as far as I understand it. How is that going? And what are the biggest things that you're running against? What are the biggest barriers that you have?
So AwayFL is our Flash emulator, which we have been working on for probably, if you count back to when we started the actual sort of process of trying to recreate the timeline animation and the vector animation side of Flash, it was around 2013, but it wasn't called AwayFL then. AwayFL in its current guise has probably been around since around 2017, 2018. It's really come on in leaps and bounds from the work that we've done, just working with different old content. The people that we work with, Pokey and Cool Math Games, are two publishers with a large back catalogue of old Flash games. So the best way of testing for us is to basically try and execute the games that they have in their back catalog and work out the kinks. And that approach has been serving us very well over the last, I'd say we've been working with Pokey since 2019, so over the last 3 or 4 years now. It's become a much more stable thing where we can throw, any old Swift at it and expect to get some sort of output. But we still have some things to do. Stage 3D, which is something that we mentioned before, is still an API that we haven't yet implemented or finished implementing. And that's one of the ones that I'd really like to get in there because, of course, a lot of my old Away 3D content would also then work in Away FL. So it would be a strange sort of completion of a circle there. But it's become much easier to test these things. And what we tend to have to deal with these days are edge cases of either the ActionScript language or the animation engine that underlies the Flash player. Obviously, we can't use any of the Flash player code or executable files because that would be copyright infringing. So everything is reverse engineered. And there were some engines which we had to draw on initially. Shumway is probably the most well-known one, which was a very useful help in the beginning where we were trying to work out a few things. But everything's been refactored to the point where there's no sort of, there's no real section left in the source code that is recognizable Shumway. Also, Gnash, which was an old C, I think it was just a vanilla C source library for the Flash player, like an emulated Flash player. That had some basic animation and scripting stuff in it, but again, it was really lacking in a lot of the key areas, and you couldn't just throw an SWF file at it and get it to run. You always had to sort of tinker and get things working manually. So yeah, the UAFL player is at a stage now where it's a lot more reliable, a lot easier for other people to try their own Swift files. We have a test your Swift function on our site awayfl.org, and you can go and sort of drop in a Swift file just to see how it runs. And it's a lot more efficient, so we can run on mobile devices now as well. And that's a real improvement for us because Flash famously ran on mobile devices for about a couple of years, and then Adobe canned it, if you remember back in, say, I think it was like 2010, 2011. So it's nice to see them finally back.
Yeah, it was interesting when some companies tried to actually get into the market by saying, we support Flash. I remember the BlackBerry tablet. That was the one that basically said, oh, if you want to have a tablet and still use Flash, we're going to support it. And
yes.
Far too late in the market. Nobody cared anymore because Apple was so cool.
Well, I totally fell for the BlackBerry tablet. I think I got 2, in fact. And I was so enamored with the fact that you could run Flash files on it. But it was very short-lived in the end. BlackBerry just did nothing to support the ecosystem, so it was a bit of a disappointment.
The Tetris version that they built for that one is still one of the best that I know. And the other one? Need for Speed Undercover, that version where you basically use it, that's wonderful. And yeah, friends of mine did the interface of the whole operating system. So it's one of those forgotten gems that really, really were forgotten rather quickly. So when you talk about Swift files, is that basically an issue that you're facing, that you will have already compiled code rather than just or packed up code rather than the source files? Did anybody keep the source files, or is it just most of the time when people come to you and say here's our old games, can you convert them? You just get a packaged Swift file at the end.
Yeah, so in the early days, we did try and use source files, and we actually had our own custom exporter in the Adobe Animate tool, which you can build using Adobe extensions. And that exported a lot of the stuff from the FLA and then used our own sort of combination of our own custom format and some additional information for the scripting to produce something that AwayFL or a proto version of AwayFL, let's say, could run. The problem with that is that most Flash devs or X-Flash devs do not have their original source files. They are lost on a disk somewhere. Nobody version controlled anything back in those days. So it's not online. It's not on a GitHub repository. It's just lost. So you're stuck with the Swift. And so we quickly moved away from that approach, because it wasn't only that we didn't have the Flash files, but the actual process of trying to recreate the Swift format is actually quite hard and cumbersome, and it wasn't particularly reliable in the end. So it actually made more sense for us to work on executing the code, unpacking and executing the code inside the Swift file itself, which is a different sort of thing to the source code, but it is actually easier to work with, more consistent, and more reliable.
I remember there were some approaches to do an open source version or package version that was compatible with Swift, and I can't remember what it was. I think it was something like can't remember. But every time that happened in the Flash world, it just basically, it seemed to me that they were like professional developers, as you said, like no version controlling, nothing like that. And that was partly because it was a black hole, because the game was in the browser in a plugin, and apparently you couldn't do anything with it. And of course you could crack it as well. But as a web developer, you always were more stringent with your code, because it was always super in public. That everything was visible. So as soon as you give developers a chance to hide inside a package format, may it be an APK or may it be something like Flash, there's a lot of code going in there that just works but is not documented.
Oh man, yeah, and commenting code as well.
Engineering that is kind of
but yeah, it's JavaScript has done amazing things for people to like finally comment their code, I think, because it's like suddenly something which is super visible, so people can easily be shamed for not like providing the necessary comments for something in their API, and it wasn't the case in Flash days, because there was just nothing that made it so visible. You were packaged up in a Swift file, and you had a binary rather than a source file to deal with, and it was easy to get away with stuff. But yeah, the Swift format itself is so well documented that it actually makes unpacking it quite simple. The problem is that the player itself, which was the proprietary element of Adobe's software suite, was not published as open source. So you basically had to guess a lot of how the timeline worked, how a lot of the interactions between the mouse and the keyboard and so on worked. And it was a painstakingly slow process, because of course you sort of basically working by trial and error to try and work out how this should actually be working. So a lot of sort of dead ends and going up the wrong way for a while, and then coming back and working out exactly what was going on. I actually, in my last talk that I gave at Half Stack, I tried to do like the simplest example of this, of how crazy that sort of timeline logic is, and it just sort of is this snake that goes back and forth, up and down like the tree, executing things in seemingly random orders. And yeah, it's a lot to untangle. Probably the hardest thing I've ever actually had to do code-wise, because you're constantly up against a wall, just trying to get to the bottom of why it's behaving in a certain way. But a lot of the sorry, go on.
When I worked on DevTools, I found the same thing, like building an interface to write code or to actually allow people to animate things in a graphical fashion is a code style than actually animating things yourself or actually creating games yourself. Like making a tool for people to create other stuff seems to be a skill set that's really, really hard to find. And it's also super frustrating if it means you have to just reverse engineer something that people loved and people really wanted to have. I had the same in the Chromium DevTools. When I tried to change anything in those, it was a big outrage. People were like, oh God, we don't want to change. We want to be like that. At the same time, they asked for new features that could not be done in the old interface. So the timeline approach, I haven't seen that in any other tool since then, to a degree. And it empowered so many people to actually do that. Is it because it's so hard to do that other tools haven't embraced it?
It could be, definitely. I mean, it's certainly a lot more complicated than you might initially think, because there's a playhead and there's nested timelines. So you can have timelines within timelines within timelines. So the logic quickly gets out of control when you're trying to actually determine what should be executed first. And The other thing that people don't realize is that in Flash, a lot of the early stuff had code actually inside the animated timeline itself, not just in separate code files. So that made it super hard to like locate where a piece of code might actually be, and also it had this sort of logic to it that wasn't necessarily always obvious as to what was going to execute first. If you jumped to a different point in the timeline, do you execute the code that you're on in the frame that you're jumping from first, and then next jump, or do you jump straight to the next frame and then execute the code there? This sort of like ordering logic becomes very convoluted. And I mean, part of the reason maybe that it's not been replicated is that it confused a lot of people as well. So it may not have been the perfect solution, but it was super easy to get into. So I think, it was like a nice low bar of entry initially for a lot of people who were essentially like designers turned developers, and, made for a really rich ecosystem of people like trying experimental things when they wouldn't have necessarily been able to achieve that with anything else.
It feels like also when it comes to the code that there's a certain way you have to define the APIs. I mean, I see the same with CSS animations now. They started really easy. They became rather complex. After a while, the events quite didn't fire the way we wanted to. So you can do the interaction between JavaScript and CSS. And then things like GreenSock came around and basically made a simple API. And now everybody is jumping on that and basically making another dependency in there rather than using the platform. But it seems a good API design is something that is not as compatible with the standard, but it basically is an extra layer on top that empowers a lot of people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I would agree. And GreenSocks is one of those ones which has sort of survived this Flash transition and become a massive deal in the JavaScript world as well. And, that's really nice to see, because it was, again, everybody used to use the GreenSocks tween libraries in Flash. So they started off in the Flash world and have like made a massive impact in the JavaScript world now as well, which is cool.
Well, I mean, we're kind of like on time. So this is supposed to be a quick chat of coffee. So what do you think people can learn from these experiences? Do you think it would make sense to actually release some of the findings that you have from conversion, or is it so niche that basically it's what you make sure is that people can watch their Flash stuff from years ago and it doesn't go away? Or is it something that a new developer could learn from as well, to see like what mess we left behind in the past?
You mean learn from our mistakes? Well, yeah, I mean, possibly. One of the things about reverse engineering something is that you also discover or rediscover all of the the incompatibilities that the original developer made. So in the Flash player, there were things like incompatibilities between how fonts were handled between versions. There were sort of weird things to do with the end of timeline events, and there were little minor details, but of course, when you come up against a Swift file that is not working because of some incompatibility, you end up rediscovering and finding these inconsistencies. So you could definitely learn from that sort of stuff, because that's sort of stuff that everyone has to deal with when developing a framework, being super consistent and testing everything to death, every little nuance and an edge case to make sure that it all is coherent. I mean, other than that, I think most people are more interested in just executing their old like files and, being able to put them somewhere online that people can still play them, because otherwise it's lost forever. And, a lot of this stuff was really groundbreaking in its day. And also, some of the older games like went on to spawn, a whole almost ecosystem of game types. I'm thinking of things like the old Bloons games or the Fancy Pants games, or, some of these really massive games in the Flash world ended up sort of creating a whole slew of additional games in the process, on desktop or on console or wherever. So it's nice to see where those have come from and to preserve that for, future game players to enjoy. There's a whole new generation now that's being introduced to things like the old flip-line cooking games, the Papa Freezeria games and all of this stuff, thanks to AwayFL. And that's really cool to see, My 7-year-old daughter is hooked on them at the moment, and it's not something that she would have ever got to experience if Flash was, left to rot and there was nothing to play it back anymore. So these still have value, and it's nice to sort of see that they're still being like enjoyed so much.
Well, that's the other question. Like when you shut down a system like Flash, like an infrastructure, would it have been the right thing to release the source code as open source to basically allow people like you to make it faster, or was that just not on in the cards at all? Was this?
I don't know.
Maybe the code was too messy and they didn't want to show it publicly. That could be the other issue.
Partly true, yes. I think there was certain things which were open sourced, like all of the Flex libraries was open sourced, if you remember, and some of the ActionScript 3 virtual machine is open sourced under something called Tamarin, which is a kind of joint Adobe Mozilla enterprise. Which is essentially a virtual machine playback mechanism for ECMAScript 4 like languages. And ActionScript 3 was actually an ECMAScript 4 based language. So those sorts of things still potentially have value, and could be used for repurposed for other uses in the future. I think the rest of it, though, is difficult to know exactly what you would do with some of that source code, other than, of course, it would help us massively to improve our emulator. So, yeah, I would not say no if Adobe decided tomorrow to open source the whole thing. But like you say, a lot of it may be, in a state that is not necessarily consumable by other developers, and then its use is limited. I would love to sort of see more. There's a few other open source engines out there that can play back Flash content, and it's always nice to see some of those, come up and be used by other people. But I'd love to see more Flash content in general relaunched and republished online, because, like I say, it's sort of something which you lose forever if you don't sort of make the effort to preserve it somewhere on the web. And I think it's a key part of the web's history, so it's not something that we should give up lightly.
Well, thanks so much for your work to make that happen. So this is one good start, I think, and a lot of people can actually maybe look at their Swift files that they have lying around, go to your site and try it out and see if it still works, because a lot of people learn from it as well. So it would be kind of I think my favorite story about that whole thing is, did you know how the name Shumway came around?
No.
It was the first renderer that they actually tried in Mozilla to show Flash was called Gordon because of Flash Gordon. And right. Gordon Shumway is the name of Alf in the TV series. That's why it's called Shumway. So it's Flash to Gordon to Shumway. That's how that happened.
I don't know, my Flash Gordon knowledge is not enough to be able to make that connection. That's hilarious. Oh my God.
So yeah, that was a great thing in Mozilla. We always named things very, very geeky that nobody understands only 5 years later. And that's why it's really hard to do code search there as well at times. So sometimes not a good idea. So thanks very much again. That was Rob Bateman. I'm going to be linking some of the talks that you've given at Halfstack and other conferences, and hopefully the video by the one that you gave about that we talked about earlier will be out by then as well, so we can cross-link that one, because it was a really, really good look into like what kind of games were there and how we could actually convert them to something new. Thanks again for your time, and hopefully, you're going to have a lot of like Flash content not being like in some bin outside the Macromedia office in a floppy disk, but actually now available on the web again.
Yeah, hopefully. Thank you very much.
See you soon.
See ya. Cheers.